right? We good on this? Okay, now let's get started. Right. So money market, right? So what is money market, right? So first thing that we need to understand that money is, you know, the money that we use to make transactions and things like that. We also studied money in our AS economics, and in that we talked about, right? I'm just giving you an overview before we get started. Let me also open my notes, right? Okay, just a second. Right. Macroeconomics. Great. Okay, now let's first talk about what is money market, right? Now, money market is basically a market, just like we talked about the labor market, just like we talked about, the product markets in AS economics, that, there's demand for a product, there's supply for a product, where the supply and demand for a product meet. That's an equilibrium in the market, right? Now, similarly, what is money market? Sometimes we also call it, capital market, right? Capital markets or money markets, right? Okay, now, first thing that's very obvious to us, being an economics student, that money is any commodity, any product that we are using to buy goods and services, right? So we use money to buy goods and services, and that is what money is, right? Nowadays, in the modern economies, we use currency notes, right? Every country has its own currency, and that is the money that we use. But that is not the only money that is there out there, right? Any commodity instrument that is used to buy goods and services, right? Is everything clear? It includes currency notes. It includes currency notes, checks, right? Currency notes, checks, and the loan created by commercial banks. Okay, now this last part that I've just mentioned would be very interesting concept, and that is what we are about to learn in today's class, right? Right, to buy goods and services. Yeah, exactly. Right. Right, exactly. So in the barter system, we used to exchange goods and services for the goods and services. In the modern economy, we don't use goods to buy other goods, but instead we use money, right? So when you go to shop to buy something, you offer them the money or the cash, and in exchange of that, they give you whatever what you want, right? As long as you're willing to give the price that that is the price of the product that you want to buy, right? So money is any commodity or instrument that is used to buy goods and services. It includes currency notes, right? As I said, check, right? Now, check is not a currency, but that check is also serving the purpose of money. Why? Because with the check, you can buy whatever you want to, right? Given that amount is available in your bank account and the check doesn't bounce, right? And the last part is loan created by commercial banks. The loan that commercial banks offer is also money. How is that money? And how commercial banks create loans and what's the purpose of that and all that stuff. So we will talk all of this in today's class. This is making sense? Okay. Now, what is money market? So money market, capital market, as it's sometimes called, right? Money or capital is basically of people wish to borrow for different purposes, right? So why do people borrow money? Including for investment, consumption, and financial institutions like banks who are willing to lend money. Now, the idea is fairly simple. What is a market? Market is where, buyers and sellers meet. That's the fundamental idea of a market, right? So when you talk about any market, there will be two participants. We know this, right? There will be buyer for the product. There will be seller for a good, right? So if you think of laptops market, who are part of the laptop market. Anyone who wants to buy a laptop is a buyer, and that would be part of the laptop market. Anyone who wants to buy, sorry, any company who is selling the laptop would be classified as a seller or the producer, and that company would be part of the laptop market. Similarly, money market is about, where the two groups, people who want to borrow money, the borrowers, and the institutions who want to lend money, like banks, are part of that market, and that is known as money market or capital market, right? So money market or capital market is basically made of people who wish to borrow money for different purposes, including for investment or consumption, and financial institutions like banks who are willing to lend money to these people. Is this simple? Okay. Now, uh, just like other markets are important for the growth of an economy, market also plays a fundamental in the progress of a country. Now think about this. What's the importance of money market, right? So think about it. If a person wants to raise a loan, why would you want to raise a loan? Because you might want to invest it in your business, or you might want to consume that money, right? So let's say if I want to buy a car and I do not have enough funds to buy a car or buy a house or something, right? So you would know that banks are offering financial products that help people to consume more than what they can afford. How? Through borrowing, right? Through borrowing, people can borrow money from a bank and they can consume more than what they have, right? So that obviously is serving an important purpose. Similarly, when people are borrowing for the sake of investment, that's also very beneficial for the economy, because more investment means more production. More production means more goods and services being produced, more output, more national income, right? So just like other markets are also important, like labor market, and so on, product markets. Similarly, capital or money market is also very important for the smooth functioning of an economy, right? Okay, now let's come to the graph, let's come to the whiteboard, and let's see how a simple bank operates, right? Now that's very important. Before we move forward, we need to know, right? Now think about this. So the idea is fairly simple and easy, right? So in the middle of everything in a financial, in a money market, there is a bank, right? Now, what's the purpose of a bank, right? So bank is basically taking money, receiving money from the people who want to deposit, right? Savers or the depositors, right? Who want to save their money in a bank. Why would you save your money in a bank? I'll tell you in a bit, right? We will talk about all of these things. And that money is being channelized to the borrowers who want to borrow money for different reasons. I just explained you that two most important reasons. In fact, these are the only two reasons why someone would want to borrow money, right? Either that is because you want to invest that money in something, in a business or in a startup or whatever, or you want to borrow that money for consumption, right? So these are the two major reasons why anyone would want to borrow money from a bank, right? Okay, now what bank is doing, and through this graph you can tell that bank is channelizing money from depositors to borrowers. Bank is channelizing money from depositors who want to save their money in the bank to the borrowers. Okay, now think about this. How in this process the bank is making profit? Let's also talk about that, right? So whenever someone borrows money from a bank, obviously, as you would know, it's not free, right? So let's say whatever amount is borrowed by the borrowers, they are paying the bank 10% interest rate, right? Now, out of this 10% interest rate, depositors also get some percentage, right? Because obviously that is incentive for the savers or the depositors to put their money in a bank, right? We do know that putting money in a bank is beneficial in one obvious sense, that, it's safe to put your money in a bank because bank is much more safe compared to, putting your money at home. But another major incentive that people have to put their money in a bank is that they get some return on that, right? Just give me a second. Okay, is this clear? Preet? Okay, now let's move on. So the two reasons why people are putting their money in the bank, right? So first, safe, right? So the money is safe in a bank, right? There are less chances of, robbery and things like that. And secondly, the incentive of interest rate, right? So just like borrowers pay interest to bank, the incentive of interest, right? Similarly, just like borrowers pay interest to a bank, similarly, depositors also receive some interest out of that amount, right? The incentive for interest. That's why people put their money in a bank. Okay. Now, moving forward, what we're about to discuss is the concept of how are interest rates determined. Now, think about this. This is something that a lot of students ask me about, and this is to some extent confusing as well. That, what are interest rates? How do they operate? And, who pays interest to whom, right? Uh, Interest rates determined. So it's sometimes confusing for students to understand that what are interest rates, first thing. Second, who pays interest and to whom, right? And how are interest rates determined? Like, who will decide that how much will be the interest? Is it the commercial banks who are determining the interest rates, or is it the state bank which is determining the interest rate, or what? How does it go, right? Okay, now think about this. Breathe, right? Now, what are interest rates? First, let's simply talk about this, right? So whenever you borrow money, right? Whenever someone borrows money, it's two things. One is the principal amount, right? That you have borrowed. Like, for instance, I go to a bank and I want to, take a loan for my education, or anyone wants to take a loan for their education, right? So they have to return the principal amount, right? So what is the principal amount? So principal amount is the actual amount that you have borrowed from a bank, right? You have to return the following, right? First is the principal amount. Principal amount is how much it was the amount that you actually borrowed from a bank, right? Are you getting me? Okay, now think about this. So if I want a loan for 10 lakh rupees, right? So how much will be my principal amount? 10 lakh rupees, right? So that I have to return to the bank for sure, because obviously that's bank's money, not my money. And that is exactly what borrowing means, that I take money from someone and then I return that money back after some time. But on top of that, it's also the interest that I'll be paying to the bank. Now, think about this. Interest is basically a percentage of the principal amount that has to be paid during during the time when the loan hasn't been paid off. Percentage of principal amount, right? So what is interest? Percentage of principal amount which has to be paid till the loan has been repaid, which has to be repaid till the borrower has completely repaid the loan, right? Is this clear? Is this simple? Okay. Now, this being said, so uh, this is what the interest is, right? Now think about this. Now, in our case, when we are thinking of a bank, so who is paying interest to who? That's what we need to know. Now, this is something that we have already discussed, right? So the borrower who is borrowing money from a bank would be paying interest to the bank, right? Obviously, simple and easy, right? Because it's the bank's money that the borrower has borrowed. But technically, it's not even the bank's money. It's the depositor's money, right? So that's why the bank is also paying, obviously not the entire amount of interest, but bank is also paying some portion of the interest that they have received from the borrower to the depositor. Bank is also paying some proportion of the interest that they have received from the borrower to the depositor, right? And as I said, that is important to incentivize the people to save their money in the bank, right? So interest is being one at one level, borrowers are paying interest to the bank, and in this case, at the second level, the bank is paying interest to the savers or the depositors. Is everyone clear on this? Preet, is it making sense? Right? So that is what interest is. And whenever there will be a loan in modern economy, whenever you take a loan, apart from your friends or family, that's a different story, right? So if you wake up one fine morning and you want to buy something, right? So perhaps you can request your parents or whatever, right, to get you something, and then you say that you can pay off that money by your pocket money, right, or something, right? Similarly, if I want to borrow from my family or friends, obviously I will just return them the principal amount. They will not charge me interest. But otherwise, in professional or in commercial transactions, whenever someone borrows any money from any entity, then they will always be paying interest, right? We got on this? Okay. Now, how are interest rates determined? Now, that's the big question. Now, there are two theories, right? So there are two theories. In fact, let's write it down over there. There are two theories that determine the interest rates, right? Interest rate. Now, the idea is that there are two theories that are part of our syllabus that explains how interest rates are determined. So the first one is Learnable funds theory. And the second one that we'll talk about is liquidity preference, right? So learnable funds theory and liquidity preference theory, right? So let's get started with the first one. So what does learnable fund theory say? Now, learnable fund theory is a very simple and straightforward, right, theory, which says that, right, which says that just like any other market, now listen to this carefully. What does learnable fund theory say? It says that just like any other market where the price of the product is determined through the demand and supply for the good, similarly, interest rates are the price of loans. Interest rates are the price of loans, right? Right? So interest rates will be determined by the supply and demand for loans, right? Have a look at this. Any other which is through its demand and supply, the interest is price of loans, and therefore interest will be determined through supply of loans. Is this clear? Is this simple, right? So how are interest rates determined? Interest rates are basically determined through the demand and supply of loans. That's what the loanable fund theory says, right? Because think about this. Now let's come to the graph, and I'll show you that we know from our, basic concepts of economics that the price of any product is determined through its demand and supply, right? So if you think of any product, let's say laptops, cell phones, cars, shoes, accessories, right? So how much is the demand for that product, right? How many consumers are demanding it, right? And how much is the supply for the good in terms of how many firms are producing it, where the demand supply are equal, that would be the equilibrium point. Similarly, in the case of loan market, it is the demand and supply of loans, right? Now we'll talk about, right? So that is what normal market looks like. Downward sloping is demand for anything, upward sloping is supply for anything, right? So where the supply and demand for a product intersect, that will be the equilibrium, right? Okay. Now for the loan market, right, the idea is that, as I said, there are two groups, right? Banks, which are providing loans, and consumers or businesses that want to borrow loans, right? That want to take loans because they're different purposes. Now, in the money market, the interest rates, according to loanable fund theory, the interest rates in the money market will be determined on the basis of demand and supply for loans, right? So on the y-axis, we say right? On the y-axis, you will have interest rates. On the y-axis, you will have interest rate, right? And on the x-axis, you'll have, on the x-axis, you will have quantity of loans, right? On the x-axis, you will have quantity of loans, right? Now, think about this. Who supply loans? Who supply loans? Breathe, right? We just talked about it. So who will supply loans in an economy? So upward sloping will be the supply and downward sloping will be the demand for loans. Why? I'll tell you in a bit, right? But who will supply loans? Exactly, the banks, right? We just talked about it. That bank is basically the intermediary between depositors, savers, and borrowers, right? So money will be, loans are being supplied by the banks, right? So upward sloping is the supply for loans. And why is that so? Just have a look at this. When, let's say, the interest rate initially was, let's say, 5%. So if initially the bank was receiving 5% interest against the money that it was issuing, right? So perhaps bank was only interested in issuing 100 million worth of loans. But then when you move from this point to, let's say, this point where the interest rates has increased, now don't you think that the bank's profits have increased? If the market is, offering higher interest rates, right? Now, instead of 5%, if the interest rate in the market is 8%, then banks will be willing to issue more loans. Why? Because that's more profitable for them. That's why supply curve is directly proportional to interest rates. Higher the interest rates, right? The more you move up on the y-axis, the more you'll move right on the x-axis, right? So that's why supply is directly proportional to interest rates. Higher the interest rates, higher the quantity of loans, or higher the loans issued by the banks, right? Okay, now who will demand loans? We have also talked about it, right? So demand for loans will be determined by banks, sorry, will be determined by businesses, right? Who want to borrow money to invest in their companies, and consumers like, you and me, right? And consumers who want to have money to buy something, a house, a car, or so on and so forth, right? Okay, now let's get rid of this extra stuff, right? So upward sloping is the supply for loans and downward sloping is the demand for loans, right? So supply of loans has direct relationship with interest rates. Higher the interest rates, higher the supply of loans, and demand for loans have inverse relationship, which means higher the interest rate, lower the demand for loans. Okay, now where the two intersect, that will be the equilibrium in the market, right? So where the demand supply for loans intersect, that's the equilibrium in the market. And what will this show us? This will show us the interest rate, equilibrium interest rate, and the quantity of loans that will be issued, right? So during a certain time period, let's say 50 million worth of loans are being issued in this country, right? And the interest rate, equilibrium interest rate is 8%. So whoever borrows money from the bank would be paying 8% interest to the bank. So that is what it shows. Any confusion so far? Preet, is this clear? Okay. Now, if this is clear, we have just discussed, okay, great, right? So we just discussed first theory of interest rate determination. So out of the two theories that we said we'll discuss, we have already covered the first one. That was learnable funds theory. Just like any other product, the price of which is determined through its demand supply, the interest is the price of loan. Interest is the price of loan, and therefore interest rates will be determined through demand and supply of loans, right? Therefore, demand and supply of loan intersect at the equilibrium point in the money market as per Learnable. Now, the second theory that we're about to discuss, that is a little tricky. That's not difficult at all, but that's a little tricky. And that's an older, relatively older theory. Now, liquidity preference theory, right? Now, before we start on this theory, right, I want to give you a little bit of background that, what are different think about this, please. Economics is still a social science. Do you know the difference between social science and natural science, right? So let's discuss this a little bit because this will come back to us again and again. So it's good to get, clear on this before we move forward from here, right? So natural science and social science, right? So natural sciences include things like mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and things like that. So in natural sciences, there are obvious, like they are straightforward answers. Straightforward, what do we mean by straightforward answers? It means that, you know, uh, it means that, let's say, if by now, at least, given the advancement that we have made, the humans have made, so we exactly know what is the process of photosynthesis. We know, how a plant grows. We know how humans, human cells, what are human cells made up of, and blah, 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 all these things. Similarly, for physics, we know how sounds travels, how waves travel, and things like that. So these are objective, right? So these are more of facts, and this is objective information, which means that there is no margin for disagreement, right? Because it can be scientifically proven, or there could be experiments that through which you can prove that what is correct and what is incorrect. So it is objective, no basis for disagreement. On the other hand, social sciences are things where it's human opinion that comes into play. So you must have studied, Preet, normative statement and positive statement in AS economics. Now, what was the difference between these? Positive economics or positive statements were ones which are a fact, right? So if I say that the rate of inflation in India, Pakistan, China, whatever, right, was this much last year, then that's a positive statement because you can verify that. You can verify that, right? Right. But what is a normative statement? Normative statement is basically that's an opinion. So if I say Pakistan should take less loan from IMF, Pakistan should spend more on education, healthcare, right? So these are what? These are my own opinions, which someone can disagree with, right? Now, subjects that are natural sciences include, history, economics, sociology, anthropology, right? And the list goes on. Now, these are not definite, right? It's more, in social sciences, there's more margin for opinions and, discussion and arguments and things like that. Whereas in natural sciences, there's no such, you know, no such space for opinions and so on and so forth, because those are facts and you can prove those facts, right? Okay. But economics, out of all these disciplines that I've mentioned on the right under the banner of social sciences, economics is slightly different. So if I have to say, economics stands somewhere in the middle, right? Economics stands somewhere in the middle of natural sciences and social sciences, right? So there's definitely margin for opinion and there's margin for agreement and so on, opinions and arguments. But at the same time, economics also includes a lot of mathematical concepts that we can prove to be true, right? Are you getting me? So economics is made up of maths, right? Which also makes it to some extent a natural science, right? Are you getting me? Because mathematical concepts are again something that you can prove to be right or wrong, right? Models. And so also would be a better word, right? Right? Made of mathematical concepts. And so it could also be defined as natural science, right? Is making sense? Okay. Now this being said, that economics is somewhere in the middle, Preet, are you following me? right? So what's the first thing that we've talked about? Why are we discussing all these things? Where is this coming from? Where are we going with this? I'll tell you everything in a bit. You don't need to worry about it. But for you now, you just need to focus on what I'm saying, right? So we started our discussion by saying that there are two, if you think of all the disciplines that we study in our life, those would be classified in two things, like medicine, biology, physics, chemistry, maths. These are natural sciences because there is one correct answer, right? We know exactly how things work, and through experiments and through observations, we can tell whether something is correct or incorrect. However, that's not the case within social sciences. In social sciences, people have their own opinions, they have their arguments, and they could be right or wrong. As far as economics is concerned, initially economics was just a social science, right? The economists used to think that this is how economy works, this is how economy should work, blah, 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 initially, back in the day. However, over time, when more research was conducted in economics and when, models, mathematical models were introduced into economics, then after that, now economics lies somewhere in the middle of natural sciences and social sciences, because a big chunk of economics is also about models that you can prove to be correct or models that you can prove to be proved for to be incorrect, right? So economics is somewhere in the middle. Now, coming back to our argument, coming back to our idea of different schools of economic thought. Now, what are these different schools of economic thought? So schools of thought are basically people, economists, that have a certain type of opinion, different school of economic thought, right? Now, economists who have, lived in this world, which are still living, right? They have made different opinions, they have made different models, right? And contributed towards economics, right? Now we can divide all these different economists, right, who have contributed to economics literature into major categories. Now, this is something that you have to pay close attention to. So all the different economists who have lived on this planet and who are still some of those who are still alive and who are contributing to economics literature, their ideas could be broadly divided into categories, right? So classical economist, right? And Keynesian, right? Keynes, as we say, Keynesian economist, right? Now, Keynesian economists were the ones, and we'll talk about this as this is part of our syllabus. So this is where we are coming towards. Keynesian economists relied more on, on theory. They were more popular during Great Depression, right? During Great Depression that came in this world in 1930s. So that is the time that was the time when Keynesian economists were really popular, and they were, contributing a lot towards economic literature during Great Depression, right? So that was the time when these economists were most popular, and that was during 1930s. Is it making sense? Okay. After that, classical economists started becoming more popular, and these were the economists who, uh, right, who came up with more mathematical concepts, became more popular after, right, 1950s, and they introduced more mathematical concepts in economics, right? More mathematical concepts in economics, right? Is everything clear? Models or concepts, right? Okay. Now, this being said, now what's the difference between classical and Keynesian economists? Apart from this, we'll talk more about it as we proceed later on. But for now, what you need to understand that Keynesian economist is a relatively older concept, and they were more popular during 1930s, and they rely more on theoretical concepts. Keynesians rely more on theoretical concepts, right? rather than mathematical concepts, whereas classical economists who became popular after 1950s, they rely more on mathematical concepts, right? Okay, now going back to this thing where this all started from was the idea of liquidity preference theory. So liquidity preference theory is a Keynesian concept, right, that explains that, that explains how interest rates are determined in the market, right? So we do know that this liquidity preference theory is a theory, it's a model that explains how interest rates are determined. But what we need to know apart from this, that it's a Keynesian concept. It's a Keynesian concept, right? Now in this, what you need to understand that Keynesians believed that interest rates are determined basis of demand and supply of money. Now think about this. You might be thinking that if this is what liquidity preference theory says, then that is also the same thing what loanable funds theory say. No, there's a minor difference that you have to pay close attention to. So in the case of loanable fund theory, it said that interest rates are determined through demand and supply for loans, whereas liquidity preference says that interest rates are determined on the basis of demand and supply of money. Money meaning currency, right? Money meaning currency, right? Okay, now this being said, right, we know it's a Keynesian concept, so it's relatively old, but liquidity preference theory says that interest rates in the market are determined on the basis of demand and supply for money, right? Now let's move forward, right? In fact, let's first complete this and then go to the graph, right? Who demands? So the first thing you should be asking yourself, who demands money, right? Right, in an economy. And similarly, we'll then talk about who supplies money. Now, the answer to these questions again relatively easy, because we have talked about this, right? Uh, right. So we have talked about this. So who demands money? Everyone, every individual in the economy demands money, because if you have to buy something, um, make transactions like buying, right? So if you think about this, every individual in an economy needs money because they have to make transactions, they have to buy goods and services with that money. So technically everyone is demanding money. But who supplies money? So who prints currency notes? Please, who prints currency note in an economy? Who prints currency notes in the economy? Right? It is the central bank, right? Exactly. Reserve Bank, central bank, right? It is the central bank of an economy, any country, and therefore it is the central bank that supplies money, right? Is everything clear on this? Okay. Now, moving forward, we will talk about this first question again, that, and this is all part of this labor, this is all part of this theory, right? So whatever we're talking within this, it is all part of the theory, right? So quick recap, we said that what is liquidity preference theory? Liquidity preference theory is a Keynesian concept that explains how interest rates are determined in the market, right? First thing. Then it says that Keynesian economists believe that interest rates are determined on the basis of demand and supply of money, right? Not on the demand and supply of loans, but instead the demand and supply of money. Now, when we talk about who demands money and who supplies money, we know that every individual, like every human being on this planet, wants money to buy the goods and services, right? So that's being answered. Then the second question we asked ourselves, that who supplies money? So we do know that in any economy, it is only the central bank which has the authority to print money. So it is technically the central bank who is supplying money. Now, for this first question, we are breaking this question even further down. This theory breaks down it into another question, that why do demand money, right? So for this A part, we are diving deep into this question. Why do people demand money? And this theory answer it like this, right? It says that there are three reasons why people want to demand money. So the first one is very obvious, that we have already talked about it, and that is known as transactional motive, right? So why do people demand money? So the first reason for demanding money is very obvious, that everyone knows, you know, I know, right? Transactional motive. We want to make transactions. I'll write down the definition. Just give me a second. Then the second reason why people want to hold money, according to this theory, is precautionary motive. What is that? We'll come back to it. And the third reason, according to this theory, why people want to hold money, that is speculative motive, right? So according to this theory, these are the three reasons why people want to demand money. Now let's define each one of these. Transactional motive is that people want to make their daily transactions, like buying goods and services that they need, right? So the first one we have already answered. Why? What is transactional motive? So transactional motive is holding money that you need for your daily transactions, like to buy, your daily food items, paying your bills, paying your electricity expense, and paying for your transport. So that is transactional motive. Then the second one is precautionary motive. Precautionary motive says, right, do you want to continue? We can continue for a bit. So I can stop the class and you can rejoin with the same link, right?